Dust. It coated everything in this village near Heiju, the packed earth of the single road, the thatched roofs sagging under the late summer sun, the faces of the few people who dared to linger outdoors. It was the dust of neglect, Kang Dae-hyun thought, the kind that settled when hope had been ground down alongside the grain. He pulled his worn traveller's hat lower, his eyes scanning the quiet desperation. Anonymity, that was all he sought. A place to rest his weary bones and let the ghosts of Jin Island fade further into memory. But peace, like clean water, seemed a luxury here. The air hung thick, not just with heat, but with a palpable tension, a collective holding of breath. He'd felt it before, in garrisons bracing for attack, in towns squeezed dry by unseen powers. Here, the power had a face, apparently. Magistrate Jo Hak-yu. The name was whispered like a curse in the meagre tavern, where Dae-hyun had traded a few copper coins for watery soup and stale barley bread. Extortion, capricious cruelty, a man fattening himself while the yuan tribute demands bled the region thin. Dae-hyun had heard countless variations of the story across the scarred landscape of Goryeo. He'd learned to keep walking. Involvement was a fool's game, paid for in blood and betrayal. The Sambiolcho had taught him that much. A commotion shattered the uneasy quiet. Shouts, the thud of wood against flesh, a cry of pain brutally cut short. Dae-hyun's hand instinctively went to the hilt of the short sword hidden beneath his cloak, a reflex honed by years of survival. He stayed put. It wasn't his fight, not anymore. But the sounds drew closer, spilling from a narrow alleyway near a modest workshop. He saw them then, 3 uniformed guards, faces impassive or sneering, surrounding a man crumpled on the ground. The man, clearly an artisan, judging by his calloused hands in the nearby kiln, struggled to rise, clutching his side. Presiding over them was a larger guard, his expression a mixture of boredom and authority. Bok-gu, Dae-hyun would later learn his name was. "The magistrate expects his due, Potter," Bok-gu stated, his voice flat. The quota was clear, pay or face the consequences. The artisan So Jin-tae spat blood onto the dusty ground. "There's nothing left. You take the pots, you take the grain tax, you take our very breath. What more can I give?" "Insolence," Bok-gu grunted, raising a thick wooden baton. A sharp cry pierced the air. A young woman, barely more than a girl, rushed from the workshop doorway. "Father, stop, please!" She reached her father just as Bok-gu's baton swung down. Not at Jin-tae, but carelessly close, a show of force. The girl flinched violently, her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on the descending weapon, on Bok-gu's impassive face, on her father's bloodied form. Then something seemed to snap within her. She stumbled back, hands flying to her head, a choked gasp escaping her lips before she crumpled to the ground, utterly still. So Ara. Jin-tae roared, a sound of pure anguish, trying to reach his daughter, but another guard kicked him viciously in the ribs. Bok-gu raised the baton again, this time aiming for Jin-tae's head. A killing blow disguised as punishment. Dae-hyun moved. He didn't draw his sword, didn't shout. He simply flowed from the shadows, a flicker of movement. His hand shot out, deflecting the baton's trajectory just enough for it to thud harmlessly into the dirt beside Jin-tae's head. Bok-gu stumbled, surprised by the unexpected interference. His eyes narrowed, locking onto Dae-hyun's for a split second, a flash of steel encountering wary curiosity. Dae-hyun offered no explanation. He met the guard's gaze, held it for a breath, then melted back into the alley's shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. He heard Bok-gu curse, ordering his men to leave the Potter be, for now. The unconscious girl was the priority. He heard Jin-tae's ragged sobs as he gathered his daughter into his arms. Dae-hyun leaned against the cool stone wall, hidden from view, the familiar bitterness rising in his throat. He hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted to see, to act, to feel the old stirrings of a justice he no longer believed in. But the image of the girl's eyes, wide with a terror that seemed to shatter her from within, wouldn't leave him. He had stopped a death, perhaps, but something else had broken in its place. He couldn't just walk away. Not yet. Guilt was a persistent shadow, harder to shake than the dust of the road. Dae-hyun found himself lingering near So Jin-tae's workshop over the next few days. He saw the village doctor leave, shaking his head. He saw Jin-tae emerge, his face etched with a grief deeper than physical pain. He learned through hushed tavern whispers what he already suspected. Ara had woken, but she could not see. Her eyes were open, unblemished, but the world remained dark to her. Trauma, the doctor had mumbled. A spirit broken by terror. Daeon felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. Another victim crushed under the heel of petty tyranny. He sought out the local temple, nestled in the low hills overlooking the village. It was a place of quiet resilience, the scent of incense a fragile counterpoint to the pervasive fear below. Master Haeon, the resident monk, was tending a small garden, his movements deliberate and serene. He looked up as Daeon approached, his eyes calm and perceptive. "You carry the dust of many roads," Master Haeon observed, his voice gentle, and the shadow of conflict. Daeon offered a non-committal bow. "I seek only temporary shelter, Master, and perhaps understanding." He hesitated, then described what he had witnessed, the beating, the girl's collapse, her current state. "The magistrate, Joe Hakyu," Master Hyun sighed, straightening up. "Magistrate Joe, he stirs the waters only to muddy them further, enriching himself from the silt. The yuan demands are heavy, yes, but Joe triples the burden for his own coffers." He looked towards the village. Young Ara, her spirit was always sensitive, like the fine porcelain her father crafts. Such brutality can shatter the vessel. "Is there nothing to be done?" Daeun asked, the question tasting like ash. He expected resignation, platitudes about endurance. Master Hyun met his gaze. "Stagnant water breeds sickness, traveller. Sometimes the mud must be disturbed for clarity to return, but one must be careful not to drown in the stirring." He offered no direct advice, only the parable. Daeun understood. Intervention was necessary, but perilous. Leaving the temple, Daeun felt a reluctant resolve harden within him. He couldn't fix Goryeo, couldn't undo the betrayals that had shattered the Sambiolcho, but perhaps he could disrupt this particular pool of stagnant cruelty. He began to watch Magistrate Joe's operations more closely. He saw the rigged scales at the marketplace, the guards confiscating goods on flimsy pretexts, the fear that silenced complaints before they were fully formed. Joe Hakyu wasn't just corrupt, he was sloppy, arrogant in his perceived impunity. He saw Bokgu often, overseeing the guards, his face a mask of indifference. Daeon noticed the slight wariness in the man's eyes, the way his hand occasionally tightened on his spear shaft when relaying one of Joe's more unreasonable demands. Not a monster, perhaps, just a cog in a cruel machine. Daeon let himself be seen occasionally, a silent presence at the edge of Joe's sphere of influence. A shadow the guards couldn't quite pin down. He knew word would reach the magistrate, a skilled stranger lingering in the village. Let Joe wonder. Let him grow uneasy. The inevitable confrontation came on a narrow path leading away from the village well. Bokgu and 2 other guards blocked his way. "The magistrate wants a word with you, traveller," Bokgu stated, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "He doesn't appreciate strangers lurking about." Daeun didn't flinch. "I am merely passing through. Does Magistrate Joe own the roads now as well as the market scales?" One of the guards lunged, impatient. Daeun sidestepped, the guard stumbling past him. He moved with blurring speed, using pressure points, leverage, not brute force. A quick strike to the nerve cluster below the jaw sent the first guard crumpling. The second hesitated, unnerved. Daeun disarmed him with a swift wrist lock, sending the sword skittering away. He turned to face Bokgu, who stood frozen, his sword half drawn. Daeun hadn't drawn his own weapon. He didn't need to. "Tell your master," Daeun said, his voice low and steady, "that some waters are deeper than they appear, and stirring them carelessly can awaken things best left undisturbed." He met Bokgu's gaze again. He saw surprise, grudging respect, and a flicker of something else, perhaps doubt. Daeun stepped past him, leaving the guards to recover their wits and their comrade. He hadn't crippled them, hadn't drawn blood unnecessarily, but he had sent a message, and perhaps, just perhaps, planted a seed in Bokgu's mind. Serving a man like Joe Hakyu, eventually the tide turned. Eventually even the enforcers paid the price for their master's greed. A direct assault on Magistrate Joe was suicide. Daeun knew that. Joe had guards, the backing of his office, and likely connections, however tenuous, to higher authorities who valued stability, even corrupt stability, as long as the tribute flowed. No, Doan needed leverage, something concrete, something that would make Joe vulnerable either to his superiors or to the simmering resentment of the populace. Master Hyeon's words echoed, enriching himself from the silt. Joe wasn't just collecting taxes, he was skimming. Tribute meant for Kaesong, or worse, for the Yuan overseers, was likely being diverted. Resources vital to the region, grain, timber, perhaps even metals, might be hoarded for personal profit. That was the weakness. Greed made men predictable and often careless. Daehyun began a different kind of campaign, one fought in shadows and whispers. He spent nights observing the Gwanga, the magistrate's office and residence complex, mapping guard patrols, noting deliveries, identifying routines. He used the skills the Sambyolcho had drilled into him, moving unseen, unheard, becoming part of the background. He needed proof. Documents. Ledgers. Hidden stores. He started small, focusing on Joe's private storehouse, a separate building behind the main Gwanga, less heavily guarded at night. The infiltration required patience, waiting for the moonless phase, observing the changing of the guard, noting the one guard who seemed prone to nodding off after midnight. He moved like smoke, scaling a low section of the wall, dropping silently into the compound. The air was still, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant snores of the sleeping guard. The storehouse door was barred, but the wood around the latch was old. A thin, sturdy knife, inserted carefully, worked as a lever. A soft click, and he was inside. The place smelled of grain, dust, and something else. Spices? Fine silks? Goods far too rich for a provincial magistrate's official stores. He worked quickly, using a small shielded oil lamp. Sacks of rice marked with official seals, but far more numerous than any recent legitimate collection could account for. Bolts of silk, clearly from trade routes further south. Tucked away in a corner, under a pile of rough sacks, he found it, a sturdy wooden chest, locked. Picking the lock was a tense affair, fingers working by feel, ears straining for any sound. Inside, not coins, but ledgers, several of them. Daehyun scanned the pages quickly. Meticulous records, not of official taxes, but of private sales. Grain sold at inflated prices to merchants passing through. Confiscated tools sold back to artisans. And most damningly, clear notations of tribute goods, rice, ginseng, bolts of hemp cloth designated for Kaesong, recorded as damaged or lost, alongside entries showing identical goods sold privately. Joe wasn't just skimming, he was systematically defrauding the state. He couldn't take the ledgers, their absence would be noticed immediately, but he had a small charcoal stick and thin parchment paper. He swiftly copied key pages, the ones detailing the tribute fraud, the large private sales. Enough to prove the pattern, enough to hang Joe if presented to the right people. Getting out was as tense as getting in. He replaced the chest, relocked it, slipped out, barred the door from the outside using the same trick in reverse, and scaled the wall, vanishing back into the night. Now came the dangerous part, using the information. He couldn't approach the provincial governor directly, who knew how deep Joe's connections went. The Yuan overseers were a possibility, but risky. Their justice was swift and often indiscriminate. He needed to apply pressure locally first, create cracks in Joe's authority. He sought out Master Hyeon again, sharing not the documents themselves, but the nature of his findings. The monk listened impassively, his fingers tracing the patterns on a smooth stone. Truth is a potent seed, Master Hyeon said finally, but it needs fertile ground to sprout. Fear hardens the earth. How to soften it, Master? Sometimes a whisper travels further than a shout. A carefully placed doubt, a shared grievance given voice, can loosen the soil. Hyun's eyes held a shrewd light. There is talk of a Yuan inspector visiting the western provinces soon. Such visits often make officials anxious. Daehyun understood. A rumor of impending inspection, combined with whispers of Joe's specific crimes, could create panic. He began subtly, letting slip details to trustworthy villagers known for quiet dissent, framing it as overheard gossip. He ensured the rumors reached the ears of Joe's other guards, the ones not in his inner circle. He even risked another brief, indirect encounter with Bok-gu. He found the guard alone near the market, overseeing the collection of stall fees. Daehyun approached casually, as if inquiring about trade routes. Heard strange talk, Daehyun murmured, keeping his voice low. About tribute rice spoiling unusually fast this season, and a Yuan inspector asking questions up north. He didn't wait for a reaction, just nodded and walked away. He saw Bok-gu's shoulders tense, saw the guard's eyes dart around, assessing who might have overheard. The seed was planted. Let it grow alongside the fear of the rumoured inspection. Joe Hakyu, feeling pressure from above and below, was bound to make a mistake. Daehyun just had to be ready when he did. The whispers worked faster than Daehyun anticipated. Fear, once seeded, sprouted quickly in the hardened soil of the village. Magistrate Joe became visibly agitated, his temper shorter, his commands harsher. The rumoured Yuan inspection, whether real or not, clearly spooked him. He doubled the guards around his residence, rarely ventured out, and took his meals alone. Then came the frantic activity. Carts being loaded under the cover of darkness. Not with official goods, but with the silk, spices and valuables from Joe's private hoard. He was planning to flee, but loose ends needed tying. Word reached Daehyun through Jin-tae, his voice trembling. Guards came. Bok-gu was with them. They said Ara and I are summoned to the Gwanga tonight, for questioning about harbouring a suspicious stranger. Jin-tae's eyes were wide with terror. It's a lie, Daehyun. He means to silence us. Daehyun's blood ran cold. Joe wasn't just running. He was covering his tracks with blood. Stay here, Jin-tae. Bar your door. Don't answer to anyone but me. He moved swiftly towards the Gwanga, the copied ledger pages secured inside his tunic. Master Haeon met him near the temple gate, alerted perhaps by the same village grapevine or by his own intuition. The water boils, the monk stated calmly. Be mindful of the steam, Daehyun. He pressed a small, tightly bound scroll into Daehyun's hand. Should the worst happen, ensure this reaches the inspector, if he comes. It details Joe's local abuses, attested by those few brave enough to mark it. Daehyun nodded, tucking the scroll away. He had hoped to avoid open conflict, but Joe had forced his hand. The Gwanga was buzzing with nervous energy. Guards loyal to Joe clustered near the main gate, weapons ready. The carts were nearly loaded. Joe himself stood near the entrance, shouting orders, his face slick with sweat despite the cool night air. Daehyun didn't try stealth this time. He walked calmly towards the gate, his hand resting lightly on his sword hilt. Magistrate Joe! His voice cut through the nervous chatter. Leaving so soon, without saying goodbye to the people you've so diligently served? Joe spun around, his face contorting with rage and fear. You! Seize him! Kill him! The loyalist guards surged forward. Daehyun drew his sword, not the short sword, but the longer, battle-tested blade he kept wrapped and hidden. It sang softly in the night air. He met the charge not with brute force, but with speed and precision. A whirlwind of deflection, evasion, and targeted strikes. He disabled rather than killed, using the flat of his blade, pommel strikes, leg sweeps. He moved like the Sambiolcho ghost Joe probably thought he was, turning their numbers against them in the confined space. He saw Bok-gu standing near Joe, spear held loosely, his face a mask of conflict. Joe screamed at him, Bok-gu, what are you waiting for? Kill the traitor! Bok-gu looked from Joe's panicked face to Daehyun, who was systematically dismantling the remaining guards. He looked towards the growing crowd of villagers, drawn by the commotion, watching fearfully from a distance. He looked down at his spear. Daehyun dispatched the last loyalist guard, who collapsed groaning. He stood facing Joe, his sword steady. It's over, magistrate! Never! Joe shrieked, drawing a decorative but sharp dagger. He lunged wildly. Daehyun sidestepped easily, caught Joe's wrist, twisted and sent the dagger flying. A sharp kick sent the magistrate sprawling onto the dirt. Bok-gu! Daehyun called out, his voice ringing with authority. You were there when Jin-tae was beaten. You were there when his daughter fell. You enforced Joe's orders. Bok-gu flinched, gripping his spear tighter. The villagers murmured, pressing closer. This man, Daehyun pointed his sword at the whimpering Joe, stole tribute meant for the state. He extorted the people he swore to protect. I have proof. He pulled out the copied ledger pages. He planned to murder an innocent man and his daughter tonight to cover his escape. He turned his attention back to Bok-gu. You followed his orders. Tell them, Bok-gu. Tell them what you did. Tell them what this man made you do. All eyes were on Bok-gu. Joe screamed threats from the ground. The villagers held their breath. Bok-gu looked at his spear, then at the fearful faces in the crowd. He looked towards Jin-tae's house, where Ara waited in darkness, his shoulders slumped. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his spear, planting the butt firmly on the ground. He turned to the crowd, his voice rough but clear. It's true. I beat Seo Jin-tae on the magistrate's orders. We enforced the false taxes. We took his goods. He swallowed hard. I saw the girl fall. We were ordered tonight to bring them here. to silence them. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, staring instead at the dirt. It was wrong, all of it. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Master Hyon stepped forward from the edge of the light. "Confession is the first step," he said, his voice carrying easily. "Restitution must follow." He gestured towards the loaded carts. "These ill-gotten gains belong to the people of this village." Daehyun bound Jo securely with rope from one of the carts. He nodded towards Bokgu. "Secure the other guards who followed his orders. They will answer for their part." As Bokgu, shamefaced but resolute, began directing the now leaderless guards, Daehyun noticed a movement near Jintae's workshop. The potter stood there, supporting Ara, who had come out, drawn by the cessation of violence, by the sound of Bokgu's confession echoing in the night. She stood uncertainly, her head tilted as if listening intently. Her face, though pale, had lost some of its vacant stillness. Hearing the specific admission, the naming of the injustice, the direct consequence falling upon the source of her terror, something profound was shifting within her. The immediate aftermath was chaos contained. Jo Hakgyu, bound and stripped of his authority, raged impotently until gagged. The evidence Daehyun had gathered along with Master Hyon's scroll was secured. Bokgu, surprisingly efficient in his newfound purpose, oversaw the detention of the most culpable guards and the inventory of Jo's stolen goods under the watchful eyes of Master Hyon and emboldened village elders. Distribution, fair and meticulous, would begin at dawn. Daehyun watched it all, a sense of weary completion settling over him. He had disturbed the stagnant water, and for now, at least, some measure of clarity had emerged. His gaze drifted towards Jintae's workshop. The potter was guiding Ara back inside, her steps hesitant. He approached quietly. Jintae looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and dawning hope. "Thank you. You saved us." Daehyun merely nodded, his attention on Ara. She stood near the doorway, her hands tracing the rough wood grain of the frame. Her face was turned towards him, though her eyes remained unfocused. "Ara?" Jintae said softly. She didn't respond verbally, but slowly, tentatively, she raised a hand, not towards her father, but towards the space where Daehyun stood, as if sensing his presence, his stillness. Then a faint furrow appeared on her brow. Her eyes blinked rapidly, once, twice. A soft gasp escaped her lips, almost inaudible. "Light," she whispered, her voice thick with disuse and wonder. "Father, there's light?" Jintae choked back a sob, rushing to her side. Daehyun watched, his own breath caught in his chest. It wasn't instantaneous. Her vision was blurred, indistinct, shapes swimming in a world previously dark, but it was returning. The confession, the tangible enactment of justice against the man who had shattered her world, had somehow unlocked the door trauma had slammed shut. Seeing, or rather hearing and knowing, the source of fear dismantled and brought low, had allowed her spirit to begin mending. Over the next few days, as the village cautiously adjusted to the absence of Jo's tyranny and awaited word from higher authorities, Ara's sight slowly improved. Shapes sharpened into forms, light resolved into colours. She saw her father's tear-streaked face clearly for the first time in weeks. She saw the familiar textures of their home, the worn tools, the clay waiting to be shaped. And eventually, she saw Kang Daehyun. He had been helping Jintae repair the workshop damage, his movements quiet and efficient. She had learned his voice, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the sense of contained strength he projected. When her vision cleared enough to distinguish features, she found herself looking at the man who had haunted the edges of her awareness. Tall, lean, with eyes that held old sorrows but also a fierce, quiet determination. A faded scar marked his forearm. He wasn't smiling, but the intensity in his gaze softened as he met her newly seeing eyes. "You can see me?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd heard it before. "Yes," Ara whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. Not a tear of sorrow, but of overwhelming release. "I can see." Daehyun simply nodded, a profound relief washing over his own features. He had fought for justice, not miracles, but witnessing this fragile recovery felt like a validation deeper than any victory in battle. Word eventually came. A stern-faced official arrived from Kaesong, escorted by disciplined soldiers who were clearly unimpressed by local squabbles, but interested in the misappropriated tribute. Jo Hakgyu was taken away in chains, his fate sealed. Bok-gu, having cooperated fully and confessed publicly, was sentenced to a period of hard labour rebuilding damaged levees further down the coast. A punishment, but also a chance to serve constructively. The village breathed a collective sigh of relief. Daehyun found himself lingering. The anonymity he craved felt less important now than the tentative peace he felt settling in his own heart. He had confronted injustice, not fled from it. He had acted, and his actions had mattered.